The room in question was the card room at the back of the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona, in the autumn of 1880, and it was a room that had developed, in the months of its operation, a specific reputation as the most profitable gambling establishment in the territory. Profitable in the way that establishments became profitable when the men running them were skilled enough at their work and the men patronizing them were willing enough to lose, and the geography of the situation made both of these things true simultaneously and continuously, and the Oriental's card room had all three of these qualities in abundance, which was why Wyatt Earp had an interest in it, specifically in the faro bank that operated there, which he had acquired an interest in through the specific combination of negotiation and presence that characterized his relationship with the commercial infrastructure of every town he worked in, the presence being the primary thing he brought to the arrangement and the negotiation being the formal mechanism by which the arrangement was established. The silence that preceded him was not a silence he produced deliberately, was not a performance or a strategy or the calculated deployment of a quality he had cultivated for its effect, but was simply what happened when he entered rooms, had been what happened when he entered rooms for the better part of a decade now, happening in Kansas cattle towns and Nevada mining camps and Arizona cattle stations and every other variety of room that the territory produced, happening with the same reliable consistency that made it feel, to the people who experienced it for the first time, like a phenomenon specific to the particular room they were in, while the people who had experienced it before recognized it as simply what Wyatt Earp's arrivals produced. The way certain weather systems produced certain atmospheric effects not because they intended to but because that was what weather systems of that particular type did when they moved through a particular kind of space. There were men in Tombstone in the autumn of 1880 who had experienced the silence before, who knew what it was and what it meant and had developed the specific relationship to it that repeated exposure produced, which was a relationship of familiarity rather than awe. The relationship of men who had been in enough rooms when Wyatt Earp entered them to understand that the silence was not a warning and was not a threat but was simply the room's collective recognition of something, or recognition that preceded conscious thought in the people doing the recognizing and that resolved, after the initial suspended moment, into the ordinary noise of human activity continuing around the presence that had arrived, and these men moved through the silence when it occurred with the practiced ease of people who had learned that it passed and that the appropriate response to it was to let it pass. There were also men in Tombstone who had not experienced it before, men who were new to the town or new to the Oriental or simply new to the specific radius within which Wyatt Earp's arrival produced its effect, and these men experienced the silence the way everyone experienced it the first time, which was with the specific quality of not knowing what it was, of feeling the room change without understanding why the room had changed, of registering the shift in atmospheric pressure without having a framework for what the shift indicated, and this quality of not knowing made the first experience of the silence something that the people who had it tended to remember and to describe to other people who had not yet had it, and the descriptions they produced were the descriptions that contributed to the accumulating account of what Wyatt Earp's presence in a room was like. Descriptions that were accurate in their particulars and that inevitably fell short of their subject in the same way that all descriptions of experiences fell short of the experiences themselves. The specific occasion of the autumn of 1880 that produced the silence that this account is an account of began with a dispute at the faro bank, which was the type of dispute that faro banks produced with a regularity that the men who ran them had learned to treat as simply one of the operational conditions of the enterprise, a dispute about whether the dealer's last turn had been conducted correctly, the kind of dispute that had at its core a question that was genuinely difficult to resolve after the fact, and that was therefore always somewhat productive of the kind of sustained disagreement that men with money on the table were inclined to sustain, and the specific dispute in the Oriental's card room on the evening in question involved three men who had been losing with the specific consistency that suggested either remarkable bad luck or a faro bank that was not entirely what it presented itself to be, and who had arrived at the moment in the evening when the accumulated losses had exceeded the threshold at which men in their condition were able to maintain the diplomatic pretense that the game was simply not going their way. The names of the three men were Calhoun, Reese, and a third man whose name the subsequent accounts were not consistent about, identifying him variously as Parker or Packard or simply as the third one. And what mattered about the three of them was not their names but their configuration in the card room at the moment the dispute escalated from the kind of dispute that was contained within the normal mechanisms of the establishment to the kind that required intervention from outside those mechanisms, the configuration being that Calhoun was standing with his hand near his weapon and Reese was at an angle to Calhoun that suggested coordination rather than coincidence, and the third man was positioned in a way that blocked the most direct exit from the room, and the dealer, a man named Cross who had been dealing faro at the Oriental for 4 months and who had seen disputes of this kind before but had not seen them in this specific configuration, was in the process of calculating what his available responses were and finding them insufficient. Someone had gone for Wyatt. The mechanics of this were simple and had become, over the months of Wyatt's relationship with the Oriental, reflexive on the part of anyone in the establishment who found themselves in a situation that exceeded the establishment's own capacity to address, the reflex being to find someone to find Wyatt. And the finding of Wyatt was itself simpler than it would have been for a man less consistent in his habits and his locations, because Wyatt was not difficult to find when the finding was necessary, was present in the places where finding him might be necessary with a regularity that reflected his understanding that the presence itself was part of what he was providing to the arrangement, and on the evening in question he was found quickly. Which was important because the situation in the card room was developing with the speed that situations involving 3 men in the specific configuration of Calhoun, Reese, and the third man developed. He came through the door of the card room. The room went silent. Not immediately, not the way a sound stops when its source is cut off, but in the specific graduated way that rooms went silent when Wyatt Earp entered them, starting at the point of his entry and moving outward through the room at a speed that was faster than thought but slower than sound, each person in the room registering the arrival at a slightly different moment and the registration producing in each of them the same effect, which was the cessation of whatever they had been doing that produced noise, and the cessation spread through the room and the room was silent, and the silence was the silence of approximately 30 people who had each, independently and in rapid succession, arrived at the same decision, which was to stop what they were doing and to direct their attention toward the door. Calhoun felt it. He felt it the way everyone in the room felt it, as an atmospheric change rather than a specific stimulus, a shift in the quality of the room's collective attention that was registered by some faculty older than vision or hearing, and his hand, which had been moving toward his weapon with the specific casual deliberateness of a man who wanted the weapon accessible without appearing to be reaching for it, stopped its movement, not because he had decided to stop it but because the atmospheric change had interrupted the progression of the decision that had been driving the movement, had inserted into the sequence between intention and action a moment of something that was not thought but was adjacent to thought, a moment of recalibration, and in that moment his hand was still. Reese felt it too, and the third man felt it, and the dealer Cross felt it with the specific quality of relief that a man in Cross's position felt when the thing that had been needed arrived before the thing that had been threatening, and the entire room was feeling it, which was the point, which was what the silence was for, was what it did in rooms when it occurred, was the specific function it served in the management of situations that had developed past the point that the ordinary mechanisms of management could address, situations that required not the application of force but the presence of the thing that made force unnecessary, and what Wyatt Earp's presence in the card room of the Oriental saloon on an autumn evening in 1880 made unnecessary was the specific chain of events that the configuration of Calhoun, Reese, and the third man had been 2 minutes from initiating. The chain of events that Cross had been unable to prevent and that Wyatt had prevented simply by entering the room and being what he was in the room he had entered. He walked to the faro bank. He stood beside the dealer. He looked at Calhoun. Calhoun looked back at him, and the looking was the continuation of the calculation that the silence had interrupted, the calculation that the atmospheric change had inserted its moment of recalibration into, and the calculation that continued from that moment of recalibration ran differently than the calculation that had preceded it. Ran with the additional input of Wyatt Earp standing beside the dealer looking at him, and the additional input changed the result, and the result that the changed calculation produced was different from the result that the original calculation had been building toward, was the result in which the hand moved away from the weapon instead of toward it, and Calhoun's hand moved away from his weapon. Reese's hand moved away from wherever Reese's hand had been. The third man's position adjusted away from the exit. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Wyatt said something to Cross, something brief and practical about the mechanics of the disputed turn, said it in the voice that was not elevated and not lowered but that carried in its evenness the specific quality of authority that had nothing to do with volume or elevation, and Cross replied, and Wyatt listened to the reply, and then he said something to Calhoun, equally brief, equally practical, and Calhoun replied, and Wyatt listened, and the listening was the same listening that he brought to everything that might be operationally relevant, the listening of a man assembling a picture from its components, and when the picture was assembled he said something else, to Calhoun and to Cross and to the room generally, something that addressed the disputed turn in a way that was sufficiently specific to communicate that he had heard and understood both accounts and was offering a resolution that was based on what he had heard and understood rather than on the authority of his position alone, and the resolution was accepted, not because it was perfect. It was not perfect. No resolution of a dispute about a faro turn could be perfect because the underlying facts were genuinely ambiguous, but because it was offered by a man whose credibility in the room was sufficient to make the acceptance of an imperfect resolution preferable to the continuation of the dispute. And this sufficiency was itself a function of the silence, was the practical expression of what the silence communicated, was the reason the silence mattered. Calhoun and Reese and the third man left the Oriental within the next 30 minutes. They left not in anger and not in defeat, because the resolution Wyatt had offered had been careful enough to give them something other than anger and defeat to leave with, had been calibrated to address the legitimate element of their complaint while declining to validate the illegitimate element, and this calibration was the specific skill that complemented the silence. The skill of using the authority that the silence established not to dominate but to resolve, not to demonstrate power but to make the demonstration of power unnecessary, which was the use of authority that Wyatt had learned, through practice in rooms across a decade of arrivals, was the use that produced the most durable outcomes, the outcomes that did not require subsequent enforcement because the resolution itself was sufficient, because the people who left accepted the resolution rather than merely complying with it. Doc Holliday was in the Oriental that evening, as he was in the Oriental most evenings, occupying a position at a separate card table with the specific quality of a man who was simultaneously a participant in the evening's proceedings and a detached observer of them. And he had watched Wyatt enter the card room and had watched the silence occur and had watched the resolution proceed and had watched Calhoun and Reese and the third man leave, and afterward, in the conversation that followed between himself and Wyatt in the quieter portion of the main saloon, had offered his characteristic observation, delivered with the wit that his Georgia education and his consumption of whiskey produced in roughly equal measure, which was that Wyatt had a gift for making rooms quieter than they had any right to be given what was in them. Wyatt had considered this. He had told Doc that the rooms didn't get quieter, that the rooms were always that quiet underneath the noise, that the noise was what happened when people forgot that the quiet was there, and that what happened when he walked in was that they remembered. Doc had thought about this for a moment. He had said that Wyatt was a philosopher after all, and that he had always suspected as much. Wyatt had said that he was not a philosopher, that he was a man who had been in enough rooms to understand how they worked. Doc had said that this was the same thing, and that Wyatt's resistance to the label was itself a philosophical position. Wyatt had let this pass, which was what he did with Doc's observations when they were accurate enough to require no response and when responding would have extended the conversation past the point where it was useful, and the conversation had moved on to other things, and the evening at the Oriental had continued, and the card room had resumed its operation, and the faro bank had turned its turns, and the noise of 30 people doing what 30 people in a saloon in Tombstone in 1880 did had rebuilt itself around the silence that Wyatt's entry had produced and that his management of the situation had resolved into the ordinary acoustic condition of a room where nothing significant was currently happening. This was the outcome. This was always the outcome, or rather this was the outcome that the silence aimed at, the outcome that the silence made possible by creating the interval in which the resolution could be offered and accepted, the outcome that required the silence to precede it because without the silence the resolution would have had no space to exist in, would have arrived too late or not at all into a situation that had already resolved itself in the direction that the configuration of Calhoun, Reese, and the third man had been building toward, the direction that required different paperwork and different conversations and the specific kind of aftermath that left rooms carrying something heavy in their air for days. The silence was not the end. The silence was the beginning of what happened when the silence ended, was the condition that made the ending possible, was the interval of collective recalibration that 30 people underwent when Wyatt Earp walked into a room, the interval during which the calculations that had been running in the room were suspended and then resumed with the additional input of his presence, and resumed running differently because the input changed the result, and the result that the different running produced was not silence but the ordinary noise of human activity in a room where something had been addressed and where the addressing had been sufficient and where the people in the room were returning to the things they had been doing before the situation required them to stop doing those things and attend to the situation instead, and this return was the point, was what all of it was for, was the reason the silence mattered, was the reason Wyatt Earp walked into rooms. The Oriental's card room had nights like this one with a regularity that would have surprised anyone who thought about what a gambling establishment in a silver boom town in the Arizona Territory in 1880 was likely to produce on a regular basis, and what would have surprised them was not the frequency of the situations but the frequency of the resolutions, the specific ratio of situations that developed to situations that escalated past the point where the development was resolved, and the ratio was what it was because of what happened in the room when Wyatt Earp entered it, because of the silence that his entry produced and the space that the silence created and the resolutions that the space allowed, and the ratio was, in the specific economy of a gambling establishment that needed to be profitable to justify the arrangements that had brought it into being, the most important number on the ledger, more important than any single night's take or any single month's profit, because what the ratio measured was the sustainability of the enterprise, the degree to which what happened in the card room could continue to happen without the specific interruptions that brought it to a halt, and the sustainability was what Wyatt was there to maintain, and the silence was how he maintained it. Tombstone would go on to produce more dramatic evenings than the one at the Oriental in the autumn of 1880, would produce the OK. Corral and everything that preceded and followed it, would produce the specific violent resolution of the specific configuration of tensions that the silver boom and the cowboys and the Earps and all the other elements of that particular convergence had been building toward through the months and years that surrounded it, and those evenings would be remembered longer and more vividly and more completely than the evening at the Oriental in the autumn of 1880, because they contained the elements that memory and legend required, the elements of drama and loss and the specific kind of irreversibility that made events feel significant in the way that a room going silent and a faro dispute being resolved did not feel significant, did not feel like the kind of thing that was remembered and told and retold and eventually became part of the permanent record of a place and a time. But the evening at the Oriental in the autumn of 1880 was part of the permanent record too, was part of what Tombstone was and what it meant that Wyatt Earp was in it, was part of the accumulated evidence for something that the dramatic evenings confirmed but that the ordinary evenings demonstrated with equal validity and considerably less cost, which was that the quality Wyatt Earp possessed that determined outcomes in rooms was not a quality that required drama to operate, was not a quality whose function was the production of dramatic resolution but whose function was the prevention of dramatic resolution, the maintenance of the conditions in which dramatic resolution was unnecessary, the management of rooms in such a way that the situations that demanded dramatic resolution were addressed before they reached the point of demanding it, and this management was the work, was the majority of the work, was the work that filled most of the evenings and most of the rooms and that produced, in the aggregate, the specific quality of the places where Wyatt Earp worked, the specific quality that was legible not in the dramatic incidents but in their relative infrequency, in the specific ratio of situations to escalations that made the Oriental's card room the kind of place it was on most evenings, which was a place where 30 people could do what 30 people in a saloon in Tombstone in 1880 did without what they were doing turning into something that required a different kind of attention. And this quality was, in the end, the most accurate measure of what Wyatt Earp brought to rooms, more accurate than any single dramatic incident and more durable, and its measurement required not the remembering of dramatic evenings but the noticing of their absence on the evenings when they might otherwise have occurred and did not, because a man walked in, and the room went silent, and then the room went on. The dealer Cross told his version of the evening to anyone who would listen in the weeks that followed, not because it was extraordinary in the sense of containing violence or dramatic confrontation, which it did not, but because of the specific quality of the memory it had produced in him, the quality of having witnessed something he found himself returning to repeatedly in the subsequent days in the way that people return to experiences that had shown them something they had not previously understood or had understood only abstractly. And what Cross had witnessed was the relationship between Wyatt Earp's arrival and what had followed it in a form that was unusually legible because the evening had been unusually close to the edge of a different outcome, unusually close to the point where the situation would have resolved itself in a way that required different paperwork, and the closeness to that different outcome made the actual outcome more visible as a specific achievement, rather than simply as the ordinary course of events. And what Cross described when he told his version was not the dramatic moment of Wyatt's entry but the quality of the silence that followed it, the way the room changed in the second after the door opened, the specific sensation of 30 people arriving simultaneously at the decision to stop and attend, and then the specific sensation of the situation that had been building toward one outcome redirecting toward a different one, and then Calhoun's hand moving away from his weapon, and then the conversation, and then the resolution, and then Calhoun and Reese and the third man leaving with something other than rage, and then the card room resuming its operation. Cross said that the thing he remembered most clearly was Calhoun's hand. He said that in the time it took for the door to open and for Wyatt Earp to appear in it, Calhoun's hand had been moving toward his weapon, had been moving with the specific quality of motion that Cross had learned to recognize as the motion that preceded the kind of evening that required different paperwork, and then the door had opened and Wyatt Earp had been in it, and the hand had stopped. And the stopping was not the stopping of a man who had decided to stop but the stopping of a man whose decision had been interrupted by something that had inserted itself into the space between the decision and its execution, and the something was the silence, was the atmospheric change that the room had undergone in the second after Wyatt Earp appeared in the doorway, and the hand had stopped because the silence had stopped it, had created the interval that the hand needed to cross between the movement toward the weapon and the movement away from it, and the interval was so small and the stopping was so complete that Cross had understood, watching it, that what Wyatt Earp had done by entering the room was not a dramatic act but a physical fact, not an intervention but a presence, not something he had done but something he was, and the being of it was what had stopped Calhoun's hand. Doc Holliday wrote about the evening, or something like it, in a letter that was recovered decades later among the papers of a cousin in Georgia who had saved all the letters Doc had sent in the years of his western sojourn, a letter whose date placed it in the autumn of 1880 in Tombstone, and which contained, among observations on his health and the weather and the quality of the whiskey available in the territory, a paragraph about Wyatt that was notable for its precision, notable because Doc was not generally a man who wrote with precision about the people in his life, preferring the oblique reference and the ironic deflection that his intelligence and his Georgia education produced in combination, but who in this letter had departed from his usual style in the direction of something that was, for him, unusually direct, and what he wrote was approximately this: that there was a man in Tombstone who had the specific quality of making rooms understand themselves, that when this man entered a room the room arrived at an accurate accounting of what it contained and what it was likely to become if nothing intervened, and that the accounting itself was the intervention, was what prevented the becoming, and that this quality was the strangest and most useful thing he had seen in the territory and possibly the strangest and most useful thing he had seen anywhere, and that he did not understand it and did not expect to understand it but had concluded that understanding it was not necessary for being grateful for it. The letter was signed with Doc's characteristic flourish and concluded with a postscript that said, in smaller handwriting, that the man in question would probably be annoyed to know he had been written about in these terms and that this was additional evidence, if any were needed, that the man in question was exactly who Doc thought he was. The man in question would indeed have been annoyed. He did not, as far as the record shows, know about the letter. He continued, through the autumn of 1880 and into the spring of 1881 and the events that would follow, to enter rooms in Tombstone and to produce in them the silence that his entries produced and to address within that silence the situations that had developed to the point of requiring his attention, and the addressing was sometimes dramatic and sometimes ordinary and was always, regardless of its specific character, the expression of the same quality that Cross had identified in Calhoun's stopping hand and that Doc had identified in the letter and that the rooms themselves identified in the second after the door opened, the quality that had no clean name and that was most accurately described by what it produced rather than by what it was, and what it produced was the silence, and the silence produced the interval, and the interval produced the possibility of resolution, and the resolution produced the ordinary noise of human activity continuing in a room where something had been addressed, and this was what happened when Wyatt Earp walked in, and this was what it meant that the room went silent, and this was why the silence mattered, and this was the work, and the work was sufficient, and it was done, and then it was done again, in the next room, at the next entry. Through all the evenings and all the rooms that produced the accumulated account of a man who understood something about rooms that most men did not understand and that the rooms themselves understood before the people in them did, which was simply this: that the noise they were making was not the room, was not what the room was underneath the noise, and that the room underneath the noise was always this quiet, was waiting to be this quiet, was the quiet that arrived whenever something entered it that the room recognized as capable of addressing whatever the noise had been building toward, and the quiet was the most honest the room was ever going to be about what it contained. And Wyatt Earp was the thing that made the room honest, and the honesty was the silence, and the silence was the room, and the room was, for that one suspended moment before the noise rebuilt itself around the resolution that the silence had made possible, exactly what it was. There is a kind of authority that operates through the demonstration of force, that requires the deployment of its most dramatic capability to establish and maintain its function, that needs to show what it can do in order to be believed about what it can do, and this kind of authority is well understood and widely documented and is the kind that most accounts of frontier law enforcement concentrated on because it produced visible and dramatic events that were easy to describe and remember and retell, and then there is another kind, less well understood and less widely documented because it produced the absence of visible and dramatic events rather than their presence, produced the situations that did not escalate rather than the situations that did, produced the evenings that ended without requiring the paperwork that the other kind of evening required, and this kind of authority was what Wyatt Earp primarily possessed and primarily exercised in the rooms of Tombstone and everywhere else he exercised it, and its primary expression was not the gunfight and not the arrest and not the direct confrontation but the silence, the interval of collective recalibration that his arrival produced and that created the space for resolutions that force would not have been able to achieve, because the situations that required force did not resolve through force but simply changed form, while the situations that resolved through the silence resolved completely, left nothing behind that required subsequent addressing, produced the outcome that stayed produced. The card room of the Oriental saloon in Tombstone in 1880 was, in this sense, the most representative location of Wyatt Earp's actual work, more representative than the OK. Corral, which was the dramatic exception rather than the ordinary condition, more representative than any of the specific confrontations that the historical record concentrated on because they were the instances when the silence had not been sufficient or had not been available, when the situation had been past the point where the arrival in the doorway could insert the interval that turned the calculation, when the situation had already resolved into the form that required force rather than presence, and what the card room represented was the majority of the work, the larger and less visible part of what Wyatt Earp's presence in Tombstone meant on a nightly basis, the part that left no specific record because it was expressed in the absence of the records it prevented, in the evenings that ended without incident because an incident had been approaching and then the door had opened and the room had gone silent and the incident had turned and become a resolution. This was the work. The OK Corral was the failure of the work, was the instance when the accumulated tensions of the territory had exceeded the capacity of the silence to contain them, when the situation had reached a point that 30 seconds of resolution rather than 30 seconds of silence was what it required, when the thing that needed to happen was not the turning of a calculation but the definitive conclusion of one, and in that sense the OK Corral was an endpoint rather than a representative sample, was the thing the work had been preventing for months and that the work eventually could no longer prevent, and the preventing was the work, and the failure of the preventing was the OK Corral, and both things together were the full account of what Wyatt Earp was in Tombstone, the ordinary evenings and the extraordinary one, the silence that usually resolved things and the gunfire that resolved the thing the silence could not, and the ordinary evenings were the larger part and the more important part and the part that made the extraordinary evening what it was, which was not the expression of what Wyatt Earp was but the exception to it, the evidence of the limits of what even the silence could do in a territory whose accumulated tensions were sufficient to exceed it. The silence continued after OK Corral, continued in the rooms Wyatt entered through the months and years that followed, continued in Pueblo and in the mining camps and in every other room he walked into through the remainder of the career that Calder Voss had declared finished and that had continued, with the same reliability and the same quality and the same relationship to the rooms it entered, for the remainder of his life, the silence arriving before him the way it had always arrived, the rooms going quiet in the second after the door opened the way they had always gone quiet, the intervals of collective recalibration occurring with the same regularity and producing the same space for resolution with the same frequency, because the quality that produced the silence was not a quality that aged or exhausted or depleted in the way that Calder Voss's confident argument required it to, was not built on the physical capabilities that time diminished but on the accumulated experience and the completeness of attention. And the absence of doubt that time refined, and the refinement was visible in the silence, in the specific quality of the interval it produced, which was, in the rooms Wyatt entered in 1883 and 1885 and 1887 and beyond, not identical to the silence of 1873 but more complete, deeper, more fully realized, the silence of a man who had been entering rooms for decades and who knew, with a completeness of knowledge that only decades of entering rooms could produce, exactly what the rooms contained. And exactly what they needed and exactly what the silence was for, which was to give the room the interval it needed to understand itself, and the room always took the interval, and the interval always produced the space, and the space always allowed the resolution, and the resolution always ended the same way, which was with the room going back to being a room, with the noise rebuilding itself around the ordinary human activity that was always what the room had actually been for, and Wyatt Earp standing in the middle of it, doing the work that had no dramatic expression, serving the function that was expressed most completely in its own invisibility, present in the room the way the quiet under the noise was always present, which was permanently and without announcement and with the specific kind of patience that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, that the quiet is always there to be returned to, that the room always goes silent when it needs to, that the silence always produces what the silence is for, and that this is sufficient, and that it has always been sufficient, and that sufficiency is enough.